The afternoon drawing room at Lady Ashworth's townhouse carried the practiced elegance of a society gathering in its final, dying hour. Porcelain teacups clinked with delicate precision as the remaining guests exchanged pleasantries about nothing of consequence: the weather, the upcoming season, the regrettable absence of Lady So-and-so. Crystal wall sconces reflected the late sunlight streaming through tall windows, casting everything in that peculiar golden haze that made even the most mundane social ritual feel momentarily significant. Kiera Dawson had claimed a chair in the corner near the Japan cabinet, a location she'd selected with deliberate care. From here, she could fulfill her social obligation of attendance while remaining largely overlooked, a position she'd come to prefer over the past 3 years as her family's circumstances had shifted from comfortable to precarious to genuinely alarming. At 25, Kiera had developed what she considered a useful skill, the ability to be present without being noticed. She was neither beautiful enough to draw admiring attention nor connected enough to warrant cultivation by ambitious mamas. Her gowns, while perfectly acceptable, were now 2 seasons behind the current fashion. The careful observer, and there were always careful observers in these rooms, might notice the way her gloves had been mended at the seams, or how she made a single biscuit last the entire hour to avoid appearing either gluttonous or wastefully selective. She'd learned to wear her reduced circumstances with quiet dignity, attending just enough events to maintain the Dawson family's claim to respectability while avoiding the more elaborate entertainments that required new gowns or reciprocal invitations. It was a careful dance, this business of clinging to the lower rungs of society while your creditors circled and your younger sister watched with increasingly worried eyes. Kiera lifted her teacup, the third refill from the same leaves. She noted Riley and surveyed the thinning crowd. Lady Ashworth was deep in conversation with Mrs. Pemberton about the scandalous behavior of someone's nephew. 2 younger ladies near the fireplace were giggling over some shared confidence. Within another quarter hour, Kiera could make her excuses and slip out unnoticed, another obligation fulfilled, another day of pretending successfully concluded. That the voice came from somewhere behind her, crisp and aristocratic, with the particular quality of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Kiera's hand stilled, the teacup frozen halfway to her lips. The words hadn't been directed at her, but something in their decisive tone made her acutely aware of her own presence in the room. I beg your pardon, Your Grace. This was Mrs. Pemberton, her tone carrying that careful deference reserved for the truly titled, that young woman by the cabinet, the one attempting to disappear into the wallpaper. Who is she? Kiera's breath caught. They were discussing her. She should stand, make her presence known, spare herself the indignity of being analyzed like a specimen, but something, curiosity, perhaps, or that same instinct for self-preservation that had kept her invisible these past years, kept her perfectly still. That is Miss Kiera Dawson, or Grace, the Dawsons of Somerset, a perfectly respectable family. Though I understand there have been some difficulties of late. Difficulties? The aristocratic voice sharpened with interest rather than disdain. What manner of difficulties? Financial troubles, I'm afraid. Her father made unfortunate investments in a shipping venture that went quite wrong. Nothing criminal, mind you, simply bad luck. Miss Dawson is entirely proper. She's been out for several seasons now, though she never quite took, too serious some say, not enough fortune to compensate for her reserve, others suggest. Hello, dear readers, before we delve into this tale of deception, dignity, and unexpected love, I invite you to subscribe and leave a comment telling me, have you ever judged someone's circumstances too quickly? Today's story will remind you that the foundations we build on lies can sometimes become the truest things in our lives if we're brave enough to choose honesty. A warm embrace to you all, and may you find courage in Kiera and George's journey. Kiera felt heat creep up her neck. This was mortifying. She set her teacup down with exquisite care, preparing to stand and end this humiliating conversation. And her family situation? How desperate are their circumstances? The casual cruelty of the question, phrased as merely practical inquiry, nearly made Kiera gasp. Mrs. Pemberton lowered her voice, forcing Kiera to strain to hear. Quite desperate, I believe, though they maintain appearances admirably. Her younger sister will have no season at all unless their situation improves dramatically. Miss Dawson herself must be aware that her prospects diminish with each passing year. At her age, she can hardly afford to refuse reasonable offers, should any materialize. Perfect, the voice declared with unmistakable satisfaction, absolutely perfect. Before Kiera could process this bewildering statement, a woman materialized beside her chair with the sudden, commanding presence of a cavalry charge. She was perhaps 60, though age had treated her with the kindness generally reserved for those of significant wealth and status. Her gown was a deep plum silk that must have cost more than Kiera's entire wardrobe, and her jewelry, understated but undeniably valuable, marked her as someone of considerable consequence. Silver blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure that suggested both fashion and authority. But it was her expression that truly arrested attention, determined, calculating, and wearing the particular smile of someone who had just solved a very complex problem. "Miss Dawson," the woman said, her voice carrying that same aristocratic authority Kiera had heard moments before. "How fortuitous to find you here. That I am Katie King, Dowager Duchess of Silverly." She extended her hand as though they were old friends. Though Kiera was quite certain they had never been introduced, the gesture was simultaneously gracious and commanding, leaving Kiera no choice but to rise and accept it. "Your Grace," Kiera managed, her mind racing. Why would a Dowager Duchess seek her out? What could she possibly want with someone of Kiera's diminished circumstances? "I wonder if you might spare me a moment in private," the Duchess continued, her grip on Kiera's hand tightening almost imperceptibly. "There is a matter of some delicacy I wish to discuss. I believe it may be of considerable interest to you." The words were phrased as a request, but everything about the Duchess's manner suggested she was unaccustomed to being refused. Around them, the remaining guests had begun to take notice, heads turning with that predatory curiosity that characterized society gatherings when something unusual occurred. Kiera's instinct screamed caution. Nothing good could come from private conversations with powerful strangers who discussed your desperation within your hearing. But as the Duchess's sharp eyes held her eyes that seemed to see far more than Kiera wished to reveal, she found herself nodding. "Of course, Your Grace." "Excellent." The Duchess's smile widened, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That I've always admired women who understand opportunity when it presents itself." She linked her arm through Kiera's with proprietary ease and began steering her toward the doorway. As they moved through the room, Kiera felt every eye follow their progress. Mrs. Pemberton looked frankly astonished. Lady Ashworth had paused mid-sentence, teacup suspended in obvious surprise. Whatever was about to happen, Kiera realized with a cold knot forming in her stomach, would be witnessed by everyone who mattered in their small social world. The Dowager Duchess had ensured that. They had nearly reached the doorway when the Duchess paused, turned back toward the room with theatrical grace, and spoke in a voice clearly calculated to carry to every corner. "How wonderful to finally meet my future daughter. Properly. My son and Miss Dawson have been so admirably discreet, but I simply cannot contain my joy any longer." Her hand moved to rest possessively on Kiera's shoulder. "That we are to have a most blessed addition to the family very soon indeed." The words hung in the air like smoke after a cannon blast. The room fell into absolute, ringing silence. Kiera felt the world tilt beneath her feet as every face in the drawing room turned toward her with identical expressions of shock. The Duchess's hand on her shoulder felt like a shackle. "We are to have an addition to the family," the implication was unmistakable. Devastating, irreversible. Kiera's expression of pure horror must have seemed, to the assembled ladies, like the shock of a secret exposed. Which was precisely, she realized with dawning terror, what the Duchess had intended. In the space of a single sentence, Katie King, Dowager Duchess of Silverly, had just announced to London society that Kiera Dawson was carrying her son's illegitimate child, and there was absolutely nothing Kiera could do to deny it without making everything infinitely worse. The Duchess's grip on Kiera's arm was surprisingly strong for a woman of her years as she swept them both out of the drawing room and down the corridor, past a startled footman and into what appeared to be Lady Ashworth's private study. The door closed with a decisive click, muffling the explosion of scandalized whispers they'd left in their wake. Kiera wrenched her arm free, her shock crystallizing into fury. "What have you done? How dare you sit down, Miss Dawson?" The Duchess's voice had shed its public warmth, revealing steel beneath silk. She gestured toward a chair with the casual authority of someone accustomed to arranging lives like chess pieces. "I will not sit. I will not participate in whatever madness this is." Kiera's hands were shaking. "You just announced to half of London society that I'm carrying your son's child. Do you understand what you've done to my reputation, my family's name?" "I understand precisely what I've done." Katie moved to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of sherry with steady hands. "I've given you a chance to save that family you're so concerned about. Drink this. You look as though you might faint, and I need you clear-headed for what comes next. I don't want your sherry. I want you to go back into that room and tell them it was a mistake, A misunderstanding, don't be foolish. The Duchess set both glasses on the desk between them. Those women heard exactly what I intended them to hear. By tomorrow morning every drawing room in London will be discussing the shocking news. There is no taking it back. Kiera felt the room spin slightly. This couldn't be happening, not to her, not like this. Then I'll deny it. That I'll tell everyone you're lying, that I've never even met your son. And who will they believe? Katie's tone was almost gentle now, the way one might reason with a frightened child. A desperate spinster with debts she cannot pay, or a dowager duchess with impeccable reputation. Even if some believed you, the scandal would destroy you just as thoroughly. A woman accused of seducing a duke, or a woman who supposedly did seduce him, either way, you're ruined. The cold logic of it hit Kiera like a physical blow. She sank into the chair, not because the Duchess had commanded it, but because her legs would no longer support her. Why would you do this to someone you don't even know? Because I've been watching you, Miss Dawson. Katie sat in the opposite chair, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. For the past 3 months, at every gathering we've both attended, I've observed you, the way you make 1 cup of tea last an hour. How you avoid conversations about the season because you cannot afford to participate, the intelligence in your eyes that you've learned to hide because clever women make society uncomfortable, and most importantly, the dignity with which you bear your reduced circumstances. How gratifying to know I've provided entertainment for my betters, Kiera said bitterly, not entertainment. Evaluation. Katie leaned forward. My son is 32 years old and has successfully avoided every marriage-minded mama in England for the past decade. The gossips are beginning to whisper about his reluctance to marry, to question whether there might be more scandalous reasons for his perpetual bachelorhood. I need those whispers to stop, and you need money. We can help each other, help each other. You've just destroyed me, not destroyed. Repositioned, the Duchess's eyes glinted. Here is what I'm offering, Miss Dawson. You will maintain this fiction for 6 months, you will move into my son's household, play the role of his betrothed expecting his child, and conduct yourself with the respectability I know you possess. At the end of 6 months, you will suffer a tragic miscarriage, society will pity you rather than condemn you. My son will have demonstrated his willingness to do the honorable thing, and you will receive £5,000, the sum stole Kiera's breath. £5,000 would pay every debt her father owed, with enough remaining to secure her sister's future. It was salvation wrapped in the most degrading package imaginable. And if I refuse, she whispered, then you leave this room as a woman accused of carrying a duke's bastard who has been publicly acknowledged by his mother, without the protection of the arrangement I'm offering. You'll face society's judgment with nothing to show for it but ruin. Your sister will never have a season, your family will be completely ostracized. Katie's voice softened fractionally. I'm not a cruel woman, Miss Dawson, but I am a practical one. I'm offering you a choice between impossible and merely terrible. Choose wisely. Kiera looked at her hands, at the mended gloves she'd worn to appear respectable, at the frayed edge of her sleeve she'd hoped no one would notice. She thought of her mother's anxious face, her sister's dimming prospects, the creditor's increasingly threatening letters. She thought of her dignity, her honor, her self-respect, and she realized that the Duchess was right. She'd already lost. This was simply negotiating the terms of surrender. I want the agreement in writing, Kiera said quietly. Katie smiled. I wouldn't expect anything less. The carriage bearing the Silverley crest rolled to a stop before an estate that seemed designed to intimidate. Silverley Manor rose against the grey London sky like a declaration of power, all classical columns and perfectly manicured grounds that spoke of centuries of wealth and privilege. Kiera sat frozen in the plush interior, the signed contract in her reticule feeling like a confession of guilt. Come along, Miss Dawson, Katie said briskly, already stepping down. George should have received my letter by now. Best to face the storm. The storm, as it turned out, was already waiting in the entrance hall. Duke George King stood at the base of the grand staircase with a letter crumpled in his fist. And the expression on his face could have curdled milk. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with dark hair that looked as though he'd been running his hands through it, and sharp features that might have been handsome if they weren't currently arranged in an expression of pure fury. His grey eyes, so like his mother's but colder, fixed on Kiera with an intensity that made her want to step backward. No, he said flatly, absolutely not. Mother, what in God's name have you done? I've secured your future, darling, Katie replied with infuriating calm, removing her gloves, and solved a rather persistent problem. You should be thanking me, thanking you. His voice rose dangerously. You announced to all of London that I've gotten some random woman with child, and you expect gratitude? Miss Dawson is hardly random. I've been quite selective. I don't care if you selected her from a catalogue of virtues. George's attention snapped back to Kiera with such force she felt pinned beneath it. And you agreed to this madness. What's your angle? How much is she paying you to play the ruined maiden? The accusation, delivered with such casual contempt, ignited something in Kiera that 3 years of diminished circumstances had nearly extinguished. Your mother is paying me £5,000 to play your betrothed for 6 months, Your Grace, since you seem to believe directness is warranted. And before you cast me as the villain in this particular melodrama, I should note that I had precisely as much choice in her initial announcement as you did. Which is to say, none whatsoever. George's eyebrows rose fractionally. You expect me to believe you're an unwilling participant? That you didn't orchestrate this with her? I expect nothing from you, Your Grace, except perhaps the basic courtesy of not accusing me of crimes I haven't committed. Kiera's voice remained steady despite her racing heart. That I was drinking tea in Lady Ashworth's drawing room when your mother decided to publicly announce my supposed condition. I had never spoken to her before that moment. That I had never even seen you before this moment. So if you're looking for a co-conspirator, I suggest you look at the woman who actually planned this entire debacle. She has a point, darling, Katie interjected mildly. You stay out of this, George snapped, though his gaze remained locked on Kiera. That if you're so unwilling, refuse. Walk out that door, tell everyone it was a misunderstanding, and be branded as either a liar or a woman who seduced a duke and was abandoned. Kiera met his stare without flinching. Your mother has already explained how thoroughly I'm trapped. The only question now is whether I'm trapped and destitute or trapped and compensated. That I chose compensation. That if that makes me mercenary in your eyes, so be it. That I've been called worse by better. Something flickered in George's expression, gone too quickly to identify. He turned to his mother with barely controlled rage. You've outdone yourself this time. Do you have any idea what you've done? The scandal if this comes out, the damage to both our names. The scandal if you continue to avoid marriage is already damaging your name, Katie replied. This way, at least, you appear honorable. A man willing to marry and provide for his child, even if tragedy prevents its birth. That I don't want to appear honorable through deception, but you're willing to let an innocent woman bear the consequences of my deception alone. Katie's tone sharpened. Because that's your only alternative, George. Deny it publicly, and Miss Dawson faces complete ruin while society applauds your rejection of a fortune hunter. The deed is done. The only choice now is how you respond to it. George closed his eyes, his jaw working. When he opened them again, the fury had been banked but not extinguished, replaced by cold calculation. Fine. If I'm to be blackmailed into this farce, we do it on my terms. Miss Dawson, you will move into this house immediately. If society is to believe this fiction, it must be airtight. That means medical examinations by my physician, carefully monitored public appearances, and absolute adherence to the timeline we establish. 6 months from today, you will suffer a convenient miscarriage and disappear from my life. Is that clear? Perfectly, Your Grace. Kiera lifted her chin. Though I should mention that treating me like a criminal you're forced to house will make the performance considerably less convincing. His eyes narrowed. Are you critiquing my approach to the deception you've agreed to participate in? I'm suggesting that if we're to convince society we're a couple in love expecting a child, perhaps you might attempt an expression slightly less murderous when you look at me. Unless the story you prefer is that you're marrying me out of grim obligation, which I suspect defeats your mother's purpose entirely. For a long moment, George stared at her in silence, then, unexpectedly, one corner of his mouth twitched. You have a sharp tongue for someone in your position, Miss Dawson, and you have a terrible temper for someone supposedly known for intellectual restraint, Your Grace, Kiera replied. Perhaps we're both full of surprises. George dismissed his mother with a curt gesture that suggested years of similar confrontations, then directed Kiera into what appeared to be his private study. The room was lined floor to ceiling with books, their spines bearing titles in Latin, Greek, and modern languages. A massive desk dominated the space, its surface covered with papers, mathematical diagrams, and what looked like architectural drawings. It was the room of a man who lived in his mind rather than the social world his title demanded. That he moved behind the desk and pulled out a sheet of heavy paper, dipping his pen with sharp, precise movements. That we will formalize this arrangement properly. That I won't have any ambiguity about the terms when this charade concludes. Kiera remained standing, watching him write with a peculiar mixture of fascination and dread. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant for someone radiating such barely controlled fury, each letter formed with the precision of a man who valued order above all else. "You will occupy the Rose Wing," he said without looking up. "It's a separate section of the manor, connected to the main house but affording privacy. You'll have your own parlor, bedchamber, and access to the gardens. Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper, will assign you a lady's maid who understands discretion. The staff will be told you're here as my betrothed due to the delicate nature of your condition. How generous, to give your purchased prisoner comfortable accommodations," Kiera said quietly. The pen stilled. George looked up, his gray eyes sharp. "Do you want me to put you in the servants' quarters instead? Because I assure you, Miss Dawson, my instinct is to make this as unpleasant as possible for everyone involved. I'm offering you comfort out of the same grim practicality that brought you here. Don't mistake it for kindness." Kiera felt her cheeks flush but held his gaze. "Noted, Your Grace, please continue outlining my terms of imprisonment." His jaw tightened, but he returned to writing. "You will be examined weekly by Dr. Thornberry, my personal physician. He will be brought into our confidence and paid handsomely for his discretion. These examinations serve two purposes: first, to maintain the medical fiction of your condition with documented evidence should questions arise; second, to ensure you don't actually become pregnant during this arrangement, which would complicate matters considerably. I'm not in the habit of seducing my jailers, Your Grace, so your virtue is quite safe. Nevertheless, the examinations are non-negotiable." He made another notation. "Public appearances will be carefully controlled. We'll attend select events where our presence together will seem natural and above reproach. My mother will serve as chaperone when appropriate, lending respectability to the situation. You will dress appropriately for your supposed condition, wearing gowns that suggest but don't explicitly confirm your state. Society loves to speculate that we'll let them." Kiera wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire burning in the grate. "And when I'm not performing for society's entertainment, you'll remain on the estate. No unauthorized visitors, no correspondence that hasn't been reviewed, no contact with your family that might compromise the arrangement that you're asking me to become a ghost for 6 months. I'm asking you to honor the agreement you made with my mother." George's voice hardened. "You wanted financial compensation for playing this role. These are the conditions under which you'll earn it, and at the end, when I've successfully pretended to carry and lose your child, Dr. Thornberry will confirm a miscarriage in the 4th month. You'll spend 2 weeks in seclusion here, supposedly recovering, then you'll return to your family with your payment and your reputation somewhat intact as the tragic woman who lost her chance at becoming a duchess. Society will pity you rather than condemn you. My mother will ensure the narrative is properly managed." How tidy. Kiera's voice came out hollow. "You've thought of everything that I've had precisely 3 hours to think since my mother's letter arrived, Miss Dawson, so I can assure you I haven't thought of everything. I'm certain this disaster will reveal complications we haven't anticipated. But these terms cover the essentials." He slid the document across the desk toward her. "Read it carefully. Once you sign, you're bound to these conditions. Break them, and you forfeit the payment and any protection this arrangement provides." Kiera forced herself to approach the desk, to read through the terms written in that precise, elegant hand. Each clause was another bar in the cage she was building around herself. No visitors without permission. No correspondence without review. Submit to medical examinations. Attend designated social events. Maintain the fiction of pregnancy and impending motherhood. Perform affection when observed. Stage a miscarriage at the appointed time. Disappear from the Duke's life completely after the arrangement concludes. There's no clause addressing how you'll treat me," she observed, her voice carefully neutral. "How I'll treat you. You've outlined my obligations in exhaustive detail, Your Grace, but nothing here prevents you from making my 6 months here a living hell. Nothing requires basic civility or respect. I'm to be imprisoned, examined, paraded about when convenient, and dismissed when useful, all while pretending to be joyfully anticipating motherhood." The imbalance seems notable. George leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "What would you have me add, Miss Dawson? A clause requiring me to smile pleasantly while my life is manipulated? A provision demanding I pretend to enjoy this farce? A single line acknowledging that I'm a person rather than a problem to be managed might suffice." Something shifted in his expression, too subtle to name. He pulled the document back, added a brief notation at the bottom, and pushed it toward her again. She read the addition, the Duke agrees to treat Miss Dawson with the basic courtesy due to any guest in his household, regardless of the unusual circumstances of her residence. Will that suffice? He asked, his tone unreadable. Kiera picked up the pen, her hand trembling slightly as she signed her name. "It will have to." The rose wing was beautiful in the way museums are beautiful, perfect, elegant, and utterly lifeless. Kiera stood in the center of her new bedchamber, surrounded by rose-patterned wallpaper and mahogany furniture that had probably cost more than her family's annual income, and felt profoundly alone. Through the windows, she could see manicured gardens stretching toward a distant tree-line, lovely and imprisoning in equal measure. A sharp knock preceded the entrance of Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper, a woman whose spine seemed constructed of iron and whose expression suggested she'd detected something unpleasant on her shoe. Behind her came a young maid with downcast eyes and trembling hands. "This is Molly," Mrs. Hendricks announced with barely concealed distaste. "She'll serve as your lady's maid. I trust you'll find the accommodations adequate." Miss Dawson, the title was delivered like an insult, a reminder that Kiera had no right to the lady she'd been born to. "Dinner is served at 8. His Grace expects punctuality." The door closed with a definitive click, leaving Kiera alone with Molly, who looked as though she might cry. "I'm sorry, miss," the girl whispered. "Mrs. Hendricks told the staff that you trapped His Grace into marriage, that you're not to be trusted. I shouldn't repeat such things, but I thought you should know what they're saying. Thank you for your honesty, Molly." Kiera managed a smile. "She didn't feel I suspect the truth is considerably more complicated than Mrs. Hendricks imagines, but I appreciate the warning." Over the following days, Kiera discovered that household staff could convey remarkable hostility through perfect politeness. Meals arrived cold. Requests were fulfilled with glacial slowness. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Only Harrison, George's valet, treated her with something approaching humanity, ensuring her comfort with quiet efficiency that suggested his employer's direct instruction. "His Grace wanted me to inform you," Harrison said one morning, delivering tea that was actually hot, "that Lady Pemberton has invited you both to dinner tomorrow evening. He says it's time to begin the performance. He'll call on you this afternoon to discuss the necessary preparations." The performance. Kiera set down her teacup with shaking hands. She'd had 5 days to adjust to her new prison, 5 days to practice the role of expectant betrothed in front of her mirror. Now she would have to convince London society of a fiction she barely believed herself. George arrived precisely at 3, looking as pleased about the upcoming evening as a man facing execution. "We need to establish some basic gestures of affection," he said without preamble, standing rigidly near the fireplace as though afraid to venture deeper into her space. "Nothing excessive, but enough to appear convincing." "How romantic," Kiera murmured. "This isn't romance, Miss Dawson. It's theater." He demonstrated the proper way to take her arm, the acceptable placement of his hand at her waist, the angle at which they should stand to suggest intimacy without impropriety. Each touch was clinical, businesslike, utterly devoid of warmth. "When we're observed, you'll look at me as though you find me tolerable. I'll attempt the same. We'll speak in low tones that suggest private understanding. Can you manage that?" "I'm not actually an imbecile, Your Grace. I'm not suggesting you are. I'm suggesting that this charade fails if either of us appears uncomfortable. So when I touch you tomorrow evening, don't flinch away as though I'm diseased." Lady Pemberton's dinner was an ordeal of candlelight and calculated glances. Kiera wore a gown carefully selected to suggest her condition without confirming it, empire-waisted in a soft blue that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she felt. George sat beside her with his hand occasionally resting near hers on the tablecloth. A gesture of possessive affection that felt as natural as speaking a foreign language. The conversation flowed around topics designed to probe without directly asking. The unusually hasty engagement, the absence of a formal announcement, the touching devotion George showed his betrothed. Kiera navigated the minefield with careful responses, aware that every word was being weighed and measured. Then Lady Thornbury, a woman with a face like a dissatisfied pug, leaned forward with a smile sharp as broken glass. "Miss Dawson, you must be so relieved that His Grace proved honorable despite the unfortunate timing of your situation. So many men wouldn't have been nearly so generous to a woman of your particular circumstances." The implication hung in the air like poison. Kiera felt her face flush, felt the weight of every eye at the table measuring her reaction. George's hand moved, covering hers completely, his grip firm and warm and unexpectedly steadying. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge Kiera had only heard directed at her before. Lady Thornbury, I'm not certain what you're implying, but let me be absolutely clear. Miss Dawson's circumstances, as you call them, are the result of my affection and her virtue, not some sordid calculation. Any suggestion otherwise insults not only her honor but my own judgment, that I trust you wouldn't wish to do that." The silence that followed was profound. Lady Thornbury's face went scarlet, and she began stammering apologies that George accepted with cold civility. Under the table, his hand remained clasped over Kiera's, his thumb moving in a small, unconscious gesture of comfort. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Kiera wondered if perhaps George King was not entirely the villain she'd cast him as. The performance, it seemed, had convinced even the performers. The days at Silverley Manor developed a rhythm as predictable as a clock's mechanism. Kiera woke to find breakfast waiting in her sitting room, spent mornings walking the gardens under the watchful eye of a groundskeeper who reported her movements, and spent afternoons in the Rose Wing's small library. George appeared only when social obligations demanded it, a brief carriage ride through Hyde Park where they might be observed, a stilted conversation in the drawing room when his mother visited, the occasional formal dinner where they performed their roles with wooden precision. Before retreating to their separate worlds that he was avoiding her, Kiera realized, as thoroughly as one could avoid someone living in one's own house. She told herself it was a relief, that his absence made the arrangement more bearable. She told herself she preferred the solitude to his cold scrutiny. She almost believed it. The Rose Wing Library became her sanctuary, a modest collection of perhaps 200 volumes that she exhausted within the first 3 weeks. One afternoon, emboldened by boredom and desperation, she ventured into the main house's library, the grand room she'd glimpsed on her first day. Harrison had mentioned his Grace spent most evenings there, but it was only 3 in the afternoon. Surely she could explore without encountering her reluctant jailer. The library was magnificent, a 2-story space with a gallery running the perimeter and windows that flooded the room with afternoon light. But it was the books themselves that stole her breath. Thousands of volumes in dozens of languages, organized with meticulous care. She found entire sections devoted to mathematics, natural philosophy, classical texts in their original Greek and Latin. This wasn't the decorative library of a gentleman who collected books for show. This was the working collection of a genuine scholar. She selected Descartes' Meditations in the original French and settled into a chair near the window. Losing herself in arguments about certainty and doubt that felt oddly relevant to her current predicament. When she found a pencil on the side table, she began making small notations in the margins, responding to Descartes' logic with her own observations, a habit from her school days that her governess had discouraged as unladylike. That's a first edition. Kiera jumped, nearly dropping the book. George stood in the doorway, still in his riding clothes, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were using the library. I'll return it immediately. You're writing in it, yes?" She felt her face flush with guilt and defiance in equal measure. "Which was unforgivably presumptuous. I'll purchase you a replacement copy, though I suspect it will take me several years to afford a first edition." George crossed the room in long strides, and Kiera braced herself for the fury she'd come to expect. Instead, he held out his hand. "May I see what you've written?" She handed him the book with trembling fingers, watching his face as he read her annotations. His expression shifted from anger to surprise to something that might have been interest. "You're arguing that Descartes' cogito ergo sum is circular reasoning. The conclusion is contained in the premise. If he doubts, he must exist to doubt, which means he's already assumed existence before proving it. It's elegant but not as foundational as he claims." Kiera hesitated. "Though I'm certain you've read dozens of more sophisticated critiques from actual philosophers." "I've read Gassendi and Hobbes, yes, but their objections focus on different aspects." George sank into the chair opposite hers, still studying her notes. "You read French, and Latin and some Greek, though my Greek is admittedly weak. My father believed daughters should be educated, even if society disagreed. Your father who made poor investments was a classicist." "My father who loved learning more than profit was a classicist," Kiera corrected quietly. "Which is perhaps why he was so easily deceived by men who loved profit more than truth." George looked up from the book, really seeing her for what felt like the first time. "What else have you read, from your library?" "Only what was in the Rose Wing. Fordyce's sermons, several volumes of improving poetry, and a surprisingly engaging text on household management." "Riveting stuff." Truly. A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. My grandmother's collection. I should have realized it would be inadequate. He stood and moved along the shelves with the ease of long familiarity, pulling volumes and stacking them in Kiera's arms. Newton's Principia. Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Spinoza's Ethics. If you're going to be imprisoned here, you might as well have something worth reading. I thought I wasn't permitted in the main library. I never said that. I said you couldn't leave the estate without permission. Reading is an escape, Miss Dawson, even if it sometimes feels like it. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. You may use this library whenever you wish, provided you continue annotating in pencil rather than ink. Some of us find contrary opinions useful for sharpening our own thinking. Kiera clutched the books to her chest, aware that something significant had shifted between them, though she couldn't name exactly what. Thank you, Your Grace, George. The word seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. If we're going to discuss philosophy, you might as well call me George. At least when we're alone, then you should call me Kiera. He nodded slowly, already moving toward the door as though regretting the moment of connection. But he paused at the threshold, glancing back. Descartes also wrote that wonder is the first of all passions, the beginning of philosophy. Perhaps that's his real contribution, not certainty, but the acknowledgement that uncertainty can lead somewhere worth going. Then he was gone, leaving Kiera alone with an armful of books and the unsettling realization that George King was far more complicated than the cold, angry man she'd been living alongside. And that complication, she suspected, was going to make everything considerably more difficult. Katie arrived on a Thursday afternoon when rain drummed against the windows and the grey light made everything feel suspended between one moment and the next. She dismissed Molly with a gesture and settled into the chair opposite Kiera with the careful movements of someone managing pain they didn't want observed. You and George have been getting along better, Katie observed, accepting the tea Kiera poured. Harrison reports you've been spending evenings in the library together. Discussing philosophy, of all things. We're not spending evenings together, Kiera corrected carefully. We happen to occupy the same room while reading separate books. Occasionally we exchange observations. It's hardly a romance, Your Grace. It's a beginning, which is more than I dared hope for 6 weeks ago. Katie set down her cup with a steadiness that seemed to require effort. I wonder if you've forgiven me yet for what I did to you at Lady Ashworth's tea. Forgiveness seems premature when I'm still living the consequences of your actions. Fair enough, Katie smiled faintly. I suppose I should tell you why I did it. Beyond the obvious reasons I've already given, the truth is rather more complicated than managing gossip or securing George's reputation. Something in her tone made Kiera set down her own cup, her attention sharpening. What do you mean? I'm dying, Miss Dawson. Kiera, Katie delivered the words with the same calm efficiency she might use to discuss the weather. Doctor Thornberry gives me perhaps 6 months, possibly less. A cancer, he calls it, though the specifics hardly matter. The outcome is the same regardless. The room seemed to tilt. Does George know? No, and you will not tell him. That's not a request, it's a condition of this conversation. Katie's voice hardened. My son would abandon everything to nurse me through the end, would sacrifice the life he should be living to sit at my bedside and watch me deteriorate. I won't allow it. When the time comes, it will come quickly enough that he won't have to endure months of anticipation. That's not your choice to make, Kiera said quietly. He deserves to know, he deserves to be happy, and he spent 32 years building walls against happiness because he's afraid of becoming like his father. Cold. Dutiful. Married to obligation rather than affection. Katie leaned forward, and for the first time, Kiera saw genuine vulnerability in those sharp eyes. I've watched my son retreat further into his books and his studies every year, convincing himself that intellectual pursuits are sufficient, that attachment is weakness, that he's brilliant and miserable, and I'll be damned if I leave this world without trying to save him from himself. So you trapped him in a fake relationship with a stranger? That's your idea of salvation? I trapped him in forced proximity with a woman intelligent enough to interest him and honest enough not to pretend to be something she's not. Katie's gaze held Kiera's with uncomfortable intensity. I watched you for months before I approached you, child. The way you discussed literature with Mrs. Pemberton when you thought no one important was listening. The Latin text I saw you reading in the corner at Lady Morrison's musicale. The way you refuse to simper or flatter or play the games other women use to attract attention. You were invisible because you chose to be, not because you lacked substance that you're giving me rather too much credit. I was invisible because I couldn't afford new gowns, you were invisible because you'd given up on being seen as anything more than a financial burden, Katie corrected, just as George has given up on being seen as anything more than a title and fortune. Two people who've stopped believing they deserve genuine connection, forced into proximity by circumstances that demand you at least pretend to connect. Can you truly not see what I was attempting? Kiera felt something cold settle in her chest. You weren't just managing scandal. You were matchmaking that I was giving my son one last chance at happiness before I leave him. Katie's voice cracked slightly, the first sign of the fear she'd been containing. And yes, I did it through deception and manipulation and outrageous disregard for both your autonomy and his. I'm not proud of my methods, Kiera, but I'm desperate. A dying woman's desperation makes monsters of us all. He'll never forgive you when he finds out the truth. Either truth, the fake pregnancy, or your illness, perhaps not. But if I'm successful, he'll have you, and that will matter more than his anger at a ghost. Katie reached across and gripped Kiera's hand with surprising strength. I'm asking you to give this a real chance. Not the performance we outlined, not the business arrangement we contracted. A genuine attempt to see if what I observed in both of you, the loneliness, the intelligence, the capacity for connection you've both been denying, might actually lead somewhere true, and if it doesn't. If we're simply two people with nothing in common beyond forced proximity, then you take your £5,000 in 4 months and leave, and I'll have failed. But if there's even a possibility, Katie's voice broke properly now. I need to believe my son won't spend the rest of his life alone in that library, brilliant and isolated and convinced that's all he deserves, please. Just try. Kiera looked at this woman who'd upended her entire life, who trapped her in an impossible situation through sheer aristocratic audacity, and saw not a villain but a mother terrified of leaving her child unprotected. It didn't excuse what Katie had done. But it explained it in ways that made Kiera's anger more complicated than she wanted it to. Be that I won't tell him about your illness, Kiera said finally. That's your truth to share when and how you choose. But I can't promise what you're asking for. I can't manufacture feelings that may not exist. That I'm not asking you to manufacture anything. I'm asking you to stop performing and see what happens when you're simply yourself with him. Katie squeezed her hand once more before releasing it. The rest, whatever it may be, will follow or it won't. At least I'll know I tried. The morning walks began as George's idea, proposed with his usual brusque practicality over breakfast one morning. The staff needs to see us together in unguarded moments. A daily walk through the gardens would serve that purpose while allowing us both exercise and fresh air, Kiera had agreed, expecting the same stilted performance that characterized their public appearances. Instead, she discovered that George was different in the gardens, away from the weight of the manor and the performance of their arrangement. He spoke about the landscaping his grandfather had commissioned, the mathematical principles behind the garden's design, the satisfaction of watching something grow according to plan yet always surprising in its details. Why father hated these gardens, George said one morning as they followed the gravel path toward the rose arbor. He said they were frivolous, that the land should be put to practical use. He wanted to tear them out and plant wheat, but he didn't. My mother wouldn't allow it. It was one of the few battles she won against him. George's expression darkened. He was a hard man, my father. Believed emotion was weakness and duty was everything. He married my mother because she was suitable, not because he loved her. Ran the estate with perfect efficiency and absolutely no joy. When he died, I don't think anyone mourned him, including those who respected him most. Kiera heard the unspoken fear beneath the words. You're not him, you know. How would you know? You've seen me at my worst. Cold, angry, treating you like an inconvenience to be managed. I've also seen you in the library, completely absorbed in a text about astronomy, muttering corrections to Newton's calculations as though he might hear you and respond. I've heard you laugh at something Locke wrote, not because it was amusing but because it was beautifully reasoned. Kiera paused by a rose bush heavy with blooms. Your father wouldn't have collected books he actually read. He would have collected them for show, the way he collected everything else. George looked at her with an expression that made her chest tighten. How do you know so much about my father? Harrison talks while serving tea. And your mother has shared a few stories, though always carefully, as if she's afraid of speaking ill of the dead. She loved him, somehow. Despite everything, she loved him. George's voice carried wonder and incomprehension. I never understood how she managed it. How she could love someone so thoroughly incapable of returning it. Perhaps she loved who he might have been if he'd allowed himself to be more than duty. Kiera met his eyes. Or perhaps love doesn't always require reciprocity to exist. Sometimes it just is, regardless of whether it's wise or returned or even acknowledged. Something shifted in his expression, but before he could respond, a gardener emerged from around a hedge, and they both resumed their public roles, conversation turning to safer topics. The weeks passed with a strange duality. In public, they were the proper couple awaiting their child, George's hand at her waist, her fingers resting on his arm, careful touches that suggested intimacy without impropriety. In private, they circled each other like cautious dancers, conversations growing deeper even as physical proximity remained carefully managed. Then came the Ashford ball, their most public appearance yet. Kiera wore a gown specifically designed for the occasion, empire-waisted with delicate embroidery that drew the eye to where a pregnant woman's figure would be changing. George arrived at her door to escort her, devastatingly handsome in his formal attire, and she felt something dangerous flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with performance. The ballroom was a crush of society's finest, all watching the Duke and his pregnant betrothed with barely concealed fascination. They danced once, carefully, George's hand steady at her back. Then Lady Morrison approached with saccharine sweetness and loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Your Grace, you must be so protective of Miss Dawson in her delicate condition. When is the blessed event expected? George's jaw tightened fractionally, but his voice remained smooth. Early spring, Lady Morrison. We're quite looking forward to it. How wonderful. May I? Without waiting for permission, Lady Morrison reached toward Kiera's stomach, that presumptuous gesture society granted pregnant women's bodies. George's hand intercepted hers, then moved to rest on Kiera's fabricated belly instead, his palm warm through the thin silk of her gown. Forgive me, Lady Morrison, but I prefer to be the one who checks on my child. His tone was light, but his touch was possessive, protective, and entirely convincing. The intimacy of the gesture, his hand spanning her waist, his body close enough that she could feel his warmth, the way he looked down at her as though she carried something precious, sent heat flooding through Kiera that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with want. Lady Morrison tittered and moved away, satisfied with the display. But George's hand remained a moment longer than necessary, his thumb moving unconsciously against her ribs. When he finally withdrew, they were both breathing carefully. That night, he walked her back to the Rose Wing in silence, heavy with things unsaid. At her door, he hesitated, his hand rising as though to touch her face before he caught himself. Kiera, he stopped, his expression tortured. This is becoming complicated in ways I didn't anticipate. That I know, her voice came out barely above a whisper. We can't. This arrangement has an end date. It would be foolish to know that too. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her temple, every line of his body suggesting he wanted to close the distance between them. Kiera tilted her face up, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. For one endless moment, they stood on the knife's edge of possibility. Then George stepped back abruptly, his expression shuddering. Good night, Kiera. He was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone with the ache of something almost happened and the terrifying realization that she was falling in love with a man she was contractually obligated to leave. The scandal sheet arrived with the Morning Post, folded discreetly beside George's breakfast plate by Harrison, whose expression suggested he'd already read the offending article. Kiera was pouring tea when George's hand stilled over the paper, his entire body going rigid in a way she'd learned to recognize as barely contained fury. What is it? She asked, though dread was already pooling in her stomach. He slid the paper across the table without a word. The headline screamed in bold type, "A Duke Trapped." Questions surround hasty engagement of His Grace the Duke of Silverley to unknown Mississippi. Kiera's hands shook as she read the venomous speculation beneath. The article stopped just short of outright accusation, but the implications were clear. She was a scheming fortune hunter who deliberately compromised herself to entrap a duke. And George was either a fool or simply doing the honorable thing for a child that might not even be his. Anonymous sources claimed she'd been seen pursuing His Grace at various events, that her family's desperate finances made her motivations obvious, that the entire situation reeked of calculation and entrapment. That I didn't write this, Kiera said quietly, setting down the paper with care. I didn't speak to any journalists, or I know you didn't. George's voice was clipped, controlled in a way that suggested volcanic rage held in check. Someone at one of our public appearances has been talking, or perhaps just speculating loudly enough to be overheard. It doesn't matter. What matters is that this stops now. That he stood abruptly, striding from the breakfast room with the paper clenched in his fist. Kiera sat alone with her cold tea, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed prison cracking around her. By afternoon, George's response appeared in the same publication and 3 others besides, a letter written with such precise, cutting eloquence that Kiera read it twice to believe he'd actually sent it. To suggest that Miss Kiera Dawson, a woman of rare integrity and intelligence, would engage in the sort of calculated manipulation your anonymous sources describe is to reveal only your own source's ignorance of her character. I am engaged to Miss Dawson not because I was trapped, but because I recognized in her qualities that society too often overlooks in its obsession with fortune and connections: genuine intellectual curiosity, moral courage, and a capacity for honesty that shames those who trade in gossip and speculation. Any further aspersions cast upon her character will be considered personal insults to my own judgment and treated accordingly. George King, Duke of Silverley. Kiera was still holding the paper when George found her in the library that evening, staring at the words he'd written as though they might rearrange themselves into something less devastating to her composure. You didn't have to defend me quite so thoroughly, she said without looking up. The article will be forgotten in a week regardless. That it won't be forgotten, and you deserved a defense. He moved to stand by the window, his reflection ghostly in the darkening glass. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Did you ever want this? Any of this? Or have you simply been enduring it because you saw no alternative? The question landed like a blow. Kiera set down the paper carefully, buying time to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much. What do you want me to say, George? That I dreamed of being publicly humiliated and then imprisoned in a stranger's house while pretending to carry his child? That this has been a delightful adventure? I want you to tell me the truth. He turned from the window, his expression raw in a way she'd never seen. Because I've been trying to understand how my mother convinced you to agree to this madness, and the only answer that makes sense is that you were truly desperate. So I made some inquiries. Kiera's stomach dropped. What kind of inquiries? I know about your father's debts. All of them. The moneylenders he borrowed from at ruinous interest. The tradesmen he hasn't paid in 2 years. The mortgage on your family's estate that's months from foreclosure. George's voice gentled slightly. Did I know that the £5,000 my mother offered you wasn't just tempting, it was the only thing standing between your family and complete ruin? Stop. Kiera stood, humiliation burning through her. I don't need your pity. It's not pity. It's understanding, finally, of what my mother did to you. She didn't just manipulate you into this arrangement, she exploited your desperation. He crossed the room until he stood directly before her. So I've paid them off. All of your father's debts, the estate is secure, your sister will have her season. You're not trapped here anymore by financial necessity. Kiera felt the world tilt beneath her feet. You did what? I couldn't undo what my mother started, but I could at least remove the chains she used to bind you here. George's expression was earnest, almost pleading. You can leave, Kiera. Right now, tonight, if you want. I'll tell society we mutually decided to end the engagement, that the miscarriage happened early. You'll still face some scandal, but you'll face it with your family's future secure. You're free, she repeated numbly. You're offering me my freedom. That I'm offering you a choice, which you never actually had before. He reached out as though to take her hand, then seemed to think better of it. Stay or go, but make the decision without the weight of your family's debts forcing your hand. Please. Kiera stared at him, this complicated, brilliant, frustrating man who defended her honor in print and then quietly moved mountains to give her back her agency. The man she'd been falling in love with despite every rational reason not to. The man who was offering her escape from a prison she'd only just realized she no longer wanted to leave. "I need time," she whispered. Katie's visit came on a grey afternoon 2 weeks before the scheduled end of their arrangement. Kiera found her in the rose wing sitting room, looking friendlier than she had weeks before, though she still carried herself with that indomitable dignity that characterized everything she did. "You're staying," Katie observed without preamble. "George told me he gave you the choice to leave, yet here you are." "I haven't decided yet," Kiera lied, though they both knew it was a lie. She'd had 3 weeks to leave and hadn't. That was decision enough. "You love him." It wasn't a question. Katie settled into her chair with the careful movements of someone managing constant pain. "I can see it in the way you look at him when you think no one's watching. The way you've stopped performing and started simply being with him." Kiera felt tears prick her eyes, a weakness she'd forbidden herself throughout this entire ordeal. "It doesn't matter what I feel. This was never supposed to be real. Loving him is it's just proximity and performance and the peculiar intimacy of shared deception. It's not genuine. It can't be." "Why not?" "Because genuine things don't start with lies. Because I don't know if what I feel is real or just gratitude that he treats me like a person instead of a problem. Because even if it is real, how could he ever trust that I'm not simply playing another role to secure my position?" Kiera's voice broke. "In 2 weeks, I'm supposed to leave." "That was always the plan. Maybe it's better that way to end things before they become even more complicated." "Or maybe," Katie said gently, "ending things when you both clearly don't want to is the cruelest thing you could do to either of you. Have you considered telling him how you feel, and risk hearing that his feelings are just obligation? That he's been kind because he pities me?" "No. I'd rather leave with my dignity intact." Katie opened her mouth to respond, but footsteps in the corridor made them both turn. George stood in the doorway. His expression suggesting he'd heard far more than Kiera would have wished. "Mother, could you give us a moment?" His voice was carefully controlled, but Kiera could hear the emotion beneath it. Katie rose with a knowing look and departed, leaving them alone in the terrible silence that followed. "How much did you hear?" Kiera asked finally. "Enough." George moved into the room but kept his distance, as though afraid she might bolt. "You love me." "I said it might be love. I also said it wasn't real, that it was just stop." The word was soft but commanding. "Stop dismissing what you feel as though it doesn't count because of how it began." "Kiera, I've spent 3 months watching you read philosophy and argue with dead men and make Harrison laugh and treat Molly with more kindness than she's probably experienced in her entire life. I've watched you navigate this impossible situation with grace and humor and honesty even when it cost you, and somewhere in all of that, I fell in love with you. Not with the performance, not with the role you were playing with you." Kiera felt her breath catch. "George, let me finish. Please." He took a step closer. "I know how this started. I know my mother manipulated us both into this situation, and I know the foundation of our relationship is built on deception. But what we've become to each other over these past months, that's real, the conversations, the debates, the way you challenge me and make me think differently about everything, that's real. So marry me. Not because of the arrangement or the scandal or any obligation. Marry me because you want to, because what we have is worth building something genuine on. You're asking out of guilt," Kiera said desperately. "Because you paid off my family's debts and you feel responsible for me." "I'm asking because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Because I wake up looking forward to our morning walks and spend my evenings hoping you'll come to the library. Because you make me want to be more than the cold, duty-bound man my father was." His voice roughened. "I love you, Kiera. Completely. Genuinely. Inconveniently. And if you leave in 2 weeks, I'll respect that choice, but I needed you to know the truth before you made it." Kiera wanted to believe him. Every part of her ached to step into his arms and accept what he was offering. But fear held her frozen. What if I'm not enough? What if without the drama and the forced proximity, you realize I'm just an ordinary woman with nothing special to offer a duke? Then I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for ordinary. Marry me, Kiera. Please. She looked into his eyes and saw no pity, no obligation, only the same terrifying vulnerability she felt. And realized that loving him meant trusting him, even when trust felt impossible. "That I can't," she whispered. Not like this. We need to end this properly, the way we planned. Then, if you still want, if this is real, we can start again. Without the lies between us, the devastation in his expression nearly broke her resolve, but he nodded stiffly. If that's what you need. 2 weeks later, Dr. Thornberry confirmed the miscarriage to a household that received the news with appropriate solemnity. Kiera spent 3 days in her room, supposedly recovering, actually packing her belongings and trying not to shatter completely. On her final morning, she walked through the gardens one last time, memorizing the paths she'd walked with George, the roses they'd discussed, the bench where they'd first debated Locke's theories of consciousness. That I was hoping I'd find you here. She turned to find George approaching, dressed simply, his expression open in a way she'd rarely seen. I came to say goodbye properly, she managed. Don't. He closed the distance between them. Not yet. Just listen. I've spent 2 weeks respecting your decision, giving you space, trying to accept that you were leaving. And I can't do it, Kiera. I can't let you go without fighting for this one more time, George. I'm not asking out of duty or guilt or because I feel responsible for you. I'm asking because you're the first person in my entire life who's made me want something beyond books and solitude. Because you're brilliant and brave and you make me laugh even when I'm determined to be miserable. Because I love you, and I hope you love me too. That he dropped to one knee on the garden path, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, simple and beautiful, with a single emerald that caught the morning light. That I commissioned this 6 weeks ago, when I finally admitted to myself what you'd become to me. Marry me, Kiera, not because of any arrangement or obligation, but because we choose each other. Because what we built from lies has become the truest thing in my life. Kiera felt tears streaming down her face. That I was so afraid you'd realize I wasn't worth choosing, and I was afraid you'd never believe you were. He smiled, still kneeling, still holding out the ring. So let's both be brave enough to choose each other anyway. What do you say? She pulled him to his feet and kissed him, pouring every ounce of love and fear and hope into the gesture. Yes, she whispered against his lips, yes, to all of it. To you. They married quietly a month later, George's mother watching with barely concealed satisfaction despite her weakening condition. Society whispered that grief had brought them together, that shared tragedy had transformed obligation into genuine affection. Let them whisper, Kiera thought as George slipped the emerald ring onto her finger for the second time, this time before witnesses who mattered. 18 months later, Kiera stood in the same garden, George's hand resting on her genuinely swelling belly, and felt their child move beneath his palm. No performance, no deception. Just the truth they'd built together from the wreckage of lies. What are you thinking? George asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. That your mother was wiser than either of us gave her credit for. Kiera turned in his arms. That sometimes the worst beginnings lead to the best endings. That I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. That's quite a lot of thinking. His smile was warm, genuine, entirely hers. Care to share any other profound observations? Just one. She pulled him down for a kiss. I'd choose you again. Every time. Even knowing how it started, I'd choose you. Good, he murmured against her lips. Because I'd choose you too, always. And in the garden where they'd first learned to be honest with each other, they stood together in a truth that needed no performance, no pretense, only the love they'd been brave enough to build from impossible beginnings.